This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
The first Black Studies Department in the United States was founded at San Francisco State University in 1967. In 2012, virtually all of the major institutions in this country have Black Studies departments. Today we talk about the future of Black Studies with Professor Eddie Glaude, who is the director of the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. And later we talk with Professor Mignon Moore, sociologist, about her new book, Invisible Families, which is about the presence of same-sex families in African American communities. I'm Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome back to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are so privileged this afternoon to be joined by Professor Eddie Glaude, who is the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University, also the chair of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University, and the author of several books, including Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America, that's University of Chicago Press 2000, and In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, also University of Chicago Press 2007. How are you doing today, Eddie?
Oh, I'm excited to have an opportunity to talk with you, Brother Mark. This is exciting.
Well, thanks for joining us. And, I think for many folks, when we think about the state of African American studies at this point in time, everybody understands the Harvard brand and the Du Bois Institute, and it's recognizable. But in terms of thinking about a group of faculty who are all almost mid-career, still have a lot of energy, still have a lot of productivity in their future, kind of charting a course in African American studies, I mean, your department comes up time and time again. Talk about what it's like, providing leadership of an African American studies department at this particular moment with our quote unquote first Black president and all the things that are going on, whether we're talking about the Occupy movement or everything else. What's it like to be at the leadership of African American studies at this point in time?
Well, it's really exciting. It's really exciting to kind of be a part of a field that's in transition. It's clear that what we're seeing is a generational shift in terms of the leadership of African American studies programs and departments and centers around the country. And that generational shift obviously reflects the kind of deepening and widening of our bibliographic sources within the field, but also the training of scholars who have written, I think, some amazing dissertations and have gone on to write some amazing books and self-identify as African Americanists. And now they are becoming tenured and taking on leadership roles and really, in some ways, Brother Mark, don't reflect some of the anxieties that have haunted the field in its earlier instantiation. So it's an exciting time, but it's also a moment of transition in terms of the economic downturn that's impacting programs and departments and centers, because usually many institutions of higher learning still don't quite understand how African American studies works within their overall curriculum. And so oftentimes in times of economic retrenchment, we are the first people on the chopping block. So we see in certain places outside of the Ivy Leagues, African American studies actually struggling to keep to maintain the quality of its course offerings and to continue to grow its faculty as faculty retire and leave. So it's a moment of transition in terms of generational shift in leadership. It's a moment of transition in terms of the economic demands on institutions, whether you're in a private institution or in a public institution. But yet and still we see an extraordinary growth among our student population. Many people have the false belief that African American studies is principally populated by students of color. That Black folk are the only folk who come to the African American studies classes. So we have over 700 plus students a year in African American studies, and you would be hard pressed to say that 700 Black folk are taking African American studies courses at Princeton. So it's exciting to kind of think about what is the field's role in an overall liberal arts education. What is the field's role in producing cosmopolitan people who are capable of not only encountering difference, but thinking about difference in very sophisticated ways. So we see that a number of our students are taking our courses, and part of what we do know in this time of transition, economic turmoil, that what we need are students who are graduating with the skill set that not only means that they can manage difference, but they can live difference as a value in their lives. And we think that African American Studies offers an extraordinary bibliography that in some ways equips students to become those kind of global citizens. So we're excited about the transition on every level. And Mark, I'm sitting around a table with some of the most brilliant minds on the planet. And it's just exciting to see the kind of youthful energy alongside of, shall we say, the veterans of African American Studies as we think together about the future. Our tagline is African American Studies for the 21st century. So we're trying to do that in a big way up here. Absolutely.
We're here with Professor Eddie Glaude, who is the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University, where he's also the chair of the Department of African and African American Studies. You know, Eddie, we both come into the academy during an era where on the one hand we have the rise and explosion of the Black public intellectual. On the other hand, you know, the Afrocentric thought still, you know, has a particular influence on where Black studies is in the early 1990s. I think both of those models, you know, if there's a place where they intersect, is this notion that there's a broader mission for African American studies, really going back to the early days of Black studies in the late 60s and early 1970s, that we're not simply ivory tower scholars, right? That we have to be engaged in other kinds of ways. Talk about some of the challenges of that mode. On the one hand, you know, trying to make sure that folks remain productive and scholarly productive in that regard, but at the same time can pass on a message to students about why it's important to be civically engaged, and also at the same time trying to deal with a university structure that doesn't always understand the value of that kind of engagement with the public.
No, absolutely. And I'm a child of both worlds, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Master's degree under Malefi Asante at Temple, and then went on to work with Cornell here at Princeton. So I kind of straddle both worlds. But what's interesting, though, Mark, is I think what's so unique about our current moment is that the anxieties that have traditionally haunted our field about our relevance to struggle in the streets, right, actually doesn't hold such, it doesn't have such a purchase on us as it did the generation preceding us. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think that a lot of the old heads, as it were, they were wringing their hands a lot about the kind of actual relevance of our actual work. I keep using that actual to the struggle of Black folk, because in some ways there was a mass struggle. There was a mass movement out in the streets that brought African American studies into being. There had to be some kind of direct relevance, you know, whether continuing ed classes, whether we would provide the space for community organizers to kind of think. And so there was this kind of pressure brought to bear on African Americanness that their work had to somehow be relevant to the liberation struggle. Right. Now, I make this distinction, right? Just because you may be working on some obscure 18th century topic doesn't mean you stop being a citizen, doesn't mean you stop being a civically engaged human being. And so part of what we're seeing and witnessing is the implication of the increasing incorporation and absorption of a field that was once on the margins of the academy, now trying to find its way into the center. And that presents all sorts of challenges as to how it will configure itself. Some people still want to be, shall we say, that that insurgent field within the academy, at the same time that they want funding, at the same time endowments, at the same time they want to be measured by the standards of our profession, you see. So part of what we've been trying to do, at least how I conceive of it, Mark, is that we have to build the bridge between the theoretical and the practical. We have to understand that the classroom, that knowledge gained in the classroom translates in very concrete and practical ways in terms of how we address problems that confront the people that we care most about. So we're not just simply talking about taking classes outside of the classroom, but no, we're trying to bring the field into the ivory tower and the ivory tower into the field in such a way that it fits with how we conceive of education. And I think that's actually part of a broader pattern in education altogether. People are, they're not just talking about this in African American studies, they're talking about this in politics, they're talking about this in history, they're talking about requirements for students who are engaging in community service, right? So part of what we're trying to do is to kind of disrupt the divide between the practical and the theoretical by thinking about African American studies as a site where those two are always already thought together without us wringing our hands about whether or not what we're doing is relevant or not, you know. Does that make sense?
That makes absolute sense. I mean, one of the things that's been very inspiring to me, looking at the collection of folks that you have there, folks like Imani Perry, Daphne Brooks. Of course, you're fortunate to work with an African American dean now, and Valerie Smith, first African American dean, right? That's important stuff. A range of colleagues. Tara Hunter is someone who comes to mind. You have these range of colleagues here, and one of the things have been really impressed and inspired about in terms of the presence of Princeton is the way that you have utilized social media. I know in particular you and Imani have very often had these very deliberate kind of public conversations that allow folks to kind of eavesdrop on two scholars thinking out loud about the world. How important has social media become for you, particularly in your leadership, but also in terms of the department as general, and really for African American studies in terms of trying to find a footing on the ground, with folks in which the work, quite frankly, the work we do is work that we hope matters to them as much as it does to us in the academy?
Well, that's a great question. And in some ways, we're just trying to follow the path that you've blazed, Mark, in so many ways. Part of what I was trying to do and what we've been trying to do is to really think about social networking platforms like Twitter as a space, a vehicle to really push information into the public domain.
Absolutely.
So that people can engage in kind of informed conversations about matters that impact their lives. And so part of what I've been trying to do, and this is part of my own self-development, trying to really step outside of a certain conception of being a public intellectual that's all about self-aggrandizement, that's all about kind of pushing your brand, but really trying to use these platforms and use my knowledge skill or my knowledge base as a way of saying, what happens if we use, how can I put this? Let me say it differently. There's this wonderful line that Van Jones gave me. What's interesting about Twitter is you got the distribution of distribution. And so what if I'm distributing and making possible, right, people to encounter Stuart Hall, people to encounter literatures that I think are actually formative to a certain kind of thinking that's critical in relation to these times. And so part of what we've been trying to do here at Princeton is utilize Twitter as a way of expanding and deepening the conversation, right? If our product is information and our market are people, how do we drive our product to market?
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is what we're trying to do. So, and in the process, creating all sorts of conversations. I remember one tweet chat that myself and Professor Perry had about our favorite books. It kind of generated because one of our followers asked us what were our favorite books. And we decided, okay, let's just have an exchange about our favorite books. And we had people from all over the world chiming in. What do you think about Gabriel Garcia Marquez? How do you think about Borges? What do you think about Alice? And it was just amazing. And this goes beyond, in my view, Mark, what I take to be the bastardization of Black public intellectual work. We got so many people who are more invested in pushing their own brand and trying to have a micro reality show around their own thoughts that we've lost sight of the public good. And I'm just trying to figure out a way of given my own journey through that. I'm not trying to say I'm not touched by it, but my own journey through this kind of increasing commercialization and commodification of Black public intellectual work, trying to figure out how Twitter and other social networking platforms can help us evade it and escape it, because we're in so much trouble. And at the very moment in which Black people are in so much trouble, it seems like there's a nadir among Black public intellectuals doing work.
Absolutely. You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Professor Eddie Glaude, who's the author of several books, including the most recent, In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America. That's University of Chicago Press, 2007. He is the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University, where he also directs the Department of African and African American Studies. We all have just recently heard the last 2 weeks or so that Cornel West is retired. Professor Cornel West is retiring from Princeton, heading back to Union Theological Seminary in New York, where he began his career. Can you talk a little bit in terms of putting his impact in some sort of context? I mean, one of the things that's really troubled me about the way a younger generation of folks have seen Professor West these last couple of years, whether it's in his critiques of Obama or the very spirited, impact he's had on the Occupy movement in terms of his presence, put into context the importance of Cornel West in terms of how he's impacted African American studies, but really all the work that we all do.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I wouldn't be, Cornell's hands are all over me.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, part of the challenge, of course, is that Cornell is a bridge figure.
Right.
You think about him as a kind of portal through which many of us had to go through in order to even think in the way in which we think. The fact that Cornell was bringing together ideas from critical theory, from post-structuralist theory. He was reading Foucault, and before Foucault hit, he was reading Derrida. He was engaged in that, you know, the critical theory collective with Paul Beauvais and others out of the University of Pittsburgh.
Boundary 2, yeah.
Exactly, doing some Boundary 2 folk, doing some extraordinary work at a time when most of us were still kind of engaged in the debates around social realism in Black fiction.
And it's funny, you know, you mentioned that kind of bridge figure. You know, I'm good friends with William Spanos, who was part of that Boundary 2 collective, and he always tells me this story about being in a car with Cornell someplace in the late 1980s. And Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" came on, and Cornell just got so excited, right? And they're all just kind of, you know, because they hadn't seen anything like this before, right?
Exactly, you know. And I mean, and think about this is so Cornell is doing that with the Boundary 2 collective, but think about what Cornell has done with regards to American pragmatism. No one really was talking about Emerson as a central figure in American pragmatism. I mean, there was Richard Poirier and Stanley Cavell, but Cornell's American Evasion offered a different kind of story, a different kind of narrative for how we understand the development, the evolution of American pragmatism. Think about what Cornell was doing in Prophesied Deliverance, his first book, where he tried to bring together a kind of Marxist tradition to bring the critique to bear on Black liberation theology by bringing the two into conversation and articulating what he called a kind of revolutionary Afro-Christianity, which has been a crucial part of his identity ever since. So I like to think of Cornell as that bridge figure without the questions he asked, without the paths that he blazed. Much of what we recognize is what we do in African American studies, at least those of us on the normative side, right, wouldn't have been possible in some ways. But, you know, people kind of get stuck on race matters. And they don't know much about ethical dimensions of Marxism. They don't know much about keeping faith and all of the essays on all of those folk. Even the folk who read the Cornell West Reader, they're really not delving into this expansiveness of his intellectual corpus. And so what we get is a caricature. What we get is a kind of commodified Cornell. What we get is, for some at least what bothered me more than anything, Brother Mark, about the reaction among the younger generation, they tried to represent him as an old man who had gone bad in the teeth. And what we do know is that Cornell exhibits in his work, in his witness, and in his daily living a kind of compassion, a discipline, and
his collegiality.
Exactly, you know. So I think I'm actually excited for him to go back to Union. I think New York is going to give him some more years on his life. I think for him to be aligning his public witness with his professional identity explicitly will be wonderful for him. I'm going to miss him, you know, terribly. We've been together for 10 years. And prior to that, you know, he's the godfather of my son. But I love him deeply. And I can't wait to see what this next stage in his intellectual life and in his public witness will look like. So I'm excited for him. And I'm excited for Union, too. That's a historic institution which needs Cornell's voice.
Absolutely.
Its history.
Absolutely. We're here with with Eddie S. Glaude, the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University, where he also directs the Department of African American Studies. I mean, speaking of kind of next moments, what are you working on these days, Eddie?
I just finished, I should say, I've been letting you do this. We're the Center for African Americans. So not quite a department yet. We still have the vestiges of Princeton. I
understand.
I just delivered the Du Bois lectures at Harvard this past week. And
talk a little bit about that. I mean, for folks who aren't familiar, I mean, this is a big deal, right? Yeah,
you know, especially for a country boy from Mississippi. You know, as my mother would say, I was in high cotton. It was an honor. You know, the Du Bois lectures for 20 plus years have been the signature lecture in our field. We've seen folk from Stuart Hall to Hazel Carvey to Paul Gilroy to Ken Warren to to Cornell West, to Melissa Harris Perry, all these folks who have delivered the lectures in these past few years. And I had the opportunity to do so from November 29th to December 1st. And what I wanted to do, Mark, is put forward a conception of African American politics rooted in what I call, following Sheldon Wolin, a politics of tending, exemplified by Miss Ella Baker. Part of what I wanted to suggest is that a kind of representational politics that informs, that has informed African American politics since slavery, actually ironically reinscribes the logics of white supremacy by treating everyday ordinary black folk like the herd. And it comes out of my reading of Adolph Reed and others. So it was really, we had a great time. So I'm working on revising those lectures. I got a new book entitled Democracy in Black that I'm working on. It's a play on left and black. No, I'm just kidding. It's Democracy in Black. It's really trying to say that until we deal with this normative conception of whiteness that overdetermines our idea of citizenship, true democratic breakthrough in the United States will always be undermined. Okay. And it's an argument that harkens back to the argument that Du Bois made in the 30s in response to Bunch and Frazier reaching for the universal category of class. And Du Bois was insisting that we had to root out, right, this racialized dimension of who we take ourselves to be as a nation if we were going to move forward. And then I'm putting together a collection of essays entitled An Uncommon Faith. You know, I'm the guy who notoriously declared the death of the Black Church.
Yes.
so I'm trying to show how faith works in my own life and in African American politics. So I got a lot on my table.
Yes, you do. And we're looking forward to all those projects, and we'll look forward to having you back on Left to Black, you know, when they're published. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Eddie S. Glaude, Jr., who's a William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University, where he's director of the Center for African American Studies. He's the author of several books, including Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in the Early 19th Century. That's University of Chicago Press in 2000. And most recently, In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, also University of Chicago Press 2007. Thanks again for joining us, Professor Glaude.
Thank you. It was an honor. Keep doing what you're doing, Doc. We need you. We need you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Good afternoon and welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Mignon Moore, Associate Professor of Sociology at UCLA and the author of the new book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, University of California Press. How are you doing today, Professor Moore?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
This is really an extraordinary book. You tell the story at the very beginning of the book of being invited to a house where there's a barbecue. And it's late in the evening, it's in Queens, and you're just noticing, you know, from a distance as you're walking to the house, the number of same-sex couples that are there, and being very intimate with each other in very public spaces. And you kind of check yourself and wonder, you know, why is it you hadn't noticed this kind of experience before? And this becomes this entry point for you to talk about the invisible lives of Black lesbians, right? The invisible family lives. Talk a little bit about how you got interested in this research.
Sure. Well, in reference to the example that you gave, I was in the field for about 8 months, and I was invited to this barbecue, and it was a barbecue given by a lesbian couple, and there were all kinds of same-sex couples there, and I realized that in Black communities, the expression of gay sexuality has been primarily in the private realm, meaning everyone has, most people have a relative that's gay, and everyone knows, but they just don't discuss it openly. And so what we've seen over the past 10 years is this movement from private to public expressions of gay sexuality in Black communities. So you have Black people who are gay who are saying that I want my family and my community to acknowledge the multiple aspects of who I am, not just the Black aspect. It's a very important part of who I am, but there are these other components. And so this is kind of the discourse and the debate and the struggle that's taking place in our communities today.
We had E. Patrick Johnson on a few months back talking about his work, Sweet Tea. And like, you know, I asked Professor Johnson at the time, you know, how difficult was it to find folks that were willing to sit down and talk to you about their lives and their experiences in this regard?
Well, it's interesting because when I first started studying Black lesbian families, I looked to the literature on the African American studies literature and the lesbian studies literature, and I couldn't find much about this group. I mean, these are people that look very familiar to me, having grown up in Black communities,
Right.
but in many
Right.
ways, they represented aspects of Black culture, but they were also gay, and so what I realized is that the researchers in this field of gay and lesbian studies, they have not had access to this population, to
Right.
people of
Right.
color who are gay. And what I did was start out by visiting different kinds of social events 2 to 5 times a week in New York. And New York just happens to be a really good place to study Black
Right.
same-sex couples, but there are other great places in the country too. So even though when I began this work, I didn't know any of these people. I had not participated in any of these communities. So I was a researcher, much like other researchers. But the difference, I think, is that I had access to these spaces because of being Black and being gay, and I was able to find out where these different events take place. So there were art salons and poetry readings and parties that and these events, these social events were organized around sexuality, but also around race and culture. And so these were places where people could listen to, reggae music. They could listen to James Brown. They could, host dinners the way that their moms and their grandmoms host dinners in these beautiful old brownstones in Harlem. So there were these different aspects of Black culture that were infused into this experience of sexuality. But when you look in the literature, you don't see much on race and sexuality because people haven't had the same kind of access.
You mentioned access, right? And I think that's an important part when we look at kind of mainstream scholarship on the LGBT community. But African American studies, that's not quite the same question of access. When you look at the literature in African American studies around Black families, there's also this tremendous absence of talking about in any significant ways the lives of these communities. What would you argue that was about?
Well, I'd say that was one about this fear that we have in Black communities in this open expression of gay sexuality, to say, to identify this behavior as an identity, to say openly, I'm going to be gay, I'm going to live with a partner, and I want people to accept us as a legitimate family. That's something that's very different. That's something that we haven't seen until recently with the change in discourse. And so I think something like Proposition 8, where we had this ballot measure in the state of California to recognize same-sex couples legally, and we had these racial differences in the vote, supporting or not supporting the measure. And this is something that kind of pushed gay sexuality in the form of same-sex marriage into the arena. So you started hearing people talking about it in barbershops and in hair salons and at the local bar and in the church pulpit. So this political act brought this discussion into the public arena, not just into the mainstream public arena, but into our private racial communities. And it's kind of forced this conversation, which is a needed conversation.
Absolutely. You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Professor Mignon Moore, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at UCLA and the author of the new book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Amongst Black Women, University of California Press. One of the things I think that's interesting about the book and refreshing in some ways is that you challenge the standard literature on how one comes into the life, if you will. And you really kind of widen the perspective of how we think about that in terms of Black women's lives in this regard. But even at the same time that you make the argument that even what you present might be somewhat limiting. Can you talk a little bit about what your research shows in terms of the various ways that Black women decide to come into the life, as it will?
Yes. So one of the main findings in my book is that the structure of family life for Black lesbians is grounded in Black culture. The women that I interviewed were born in the 1960s and 1970s in, of course, in New York City, but in other cities across the country, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Alabama, as well as in small towns in the South, South Carolina, and in the Caribbean. And so when they enter into their sexuality, they come with particular cultural understandings of themselves as Black girls. And so that influences how they think about their sexuality, the things that they look for in their mates, how children come into the family. And what I found is that when they enter into a gay sexuality, they do that in Black social spaces. So these are women who first came into the life by going to Black parties, private house parties, and other people's homes in Harlem and in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, in small towns in Jamaica where they meet at people's homes and no one knows that it's a gay or lesbian event.
Because it has to be private, right? It can't be.
Right, and so all of these things shape how they think about their sexuality. They don't tend to come into their sexuality in women's studies classes or consciousness raising meetings.
That's a different model, right?
Right, and so all of these things shape who they are, and it shapes their relationship, the ongoing relationships they have with the racial community.
I think it's important. You mentioned the point that for many of these women, it still remains a premium for them to be still connected to Black communities, right? To be racially identified in Black communities, to have this kind of broader community of support, even as they're negotiating coming out in some of these spaces.
Yes, and I think that's something that both the larger LGBT community as well as the racial community has not yet understood.
Yeah.
So if you look at, for example, at the census, you find that Black same-sex couples live in cities and towns where there are significant populations of Black people. So they're heavily concentrated in places like New York and Detroit and Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, but also in southern towns in South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. These are where these Black gay couples are living because they're living with the racial community.
And you mentioned that, particularly for Black teens and young Black adults, women, that the ability to be able to have a certain kind of social mobility in urban centers where they can take public transportation allows them to be able to explore the confines of their sexualities in ways that they might not have been able to do in kind of smaller rural towns in that same context.
Yes, one thing I found in my book, Invisible Families, is that in order for people to really come into an understanding of themselves as gay, they often have to geographically, physically separate themselves from their families of origin. That doesn't mean separating from the racial community, but it does mean perhaps moving out of their parents' home or out of the neighborhood they grew up in or away from the church that they grew up in, because there are these pulls, these competing pressures to stay in the closet, to conform to what society says is appropriate and respectable for women, and then to live a free life, to have sexual autonomy and freedom as openly gay. And so what I find is that they tend to leave their families of origin for a time until they're more comfortable with their sexuality, and then they tend to return and try to negotiate a balance.
You're watching Left of Black. We're here with Professor Mignon Moore, Associate Professor of Sociology at UCLA, almost said USC there. Author of the new book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women. That's the University of California Press. One of the things, when we think about really great scholarship, right? Really great scholarship, I think, does a couple of things. One, it literally breaks ground. Creating a new space for us to think and talk about certain kind of issues that hadn't existed before. But there's also great scholarship that fills gaps, right? Gaps in knowledge that are not there. Did you find that there was a lot of scholarship that was out there to enable you to really find great information and data? on the lives of Black lesbians as mothers. It strikes me that, beyond kind of the autobiographical and anecdotal work that we get from someone like Audre Lorde, there's not a whole lot of scholarship out there that really addresses Black lesbians as mothers, Black lesbians in same-sex families.
Right. There is not much research, social science research that examines the intersections of race and gender and sexuality, particularly for same-gender loving people. We see some work in the humanities. We see some work with men, but not with families, and certainly not with Black women. And so this is one area that I hope to create a bridge between the Black feminist literature on mothers in Black communities and the sexuality literature to show how these women take aspects of both. So in terms of Black womanhood, they very much live their lives around questions of respectability. And so when you think about marriage and this question of same-sex marriage, it's a sign of respectability, of doing the right thing, of countering negative images of Black sexuality.
Right.
Like
this idea of a virtuous womanhood, right?
Right, a virtuous womanhood. But at the same time, they are asserting a sexual autonomy and a sexual freedom. And so you have these things that kind of in conflict, because with respectability comes kind of a silencing about sexuality. But here they are, as they live openly gay lives, they are sexual beings, right? That's something that people think about when they think about lesbian sexuality. So you have this combination of Black respectability and Black womanhood and racial group uplift, along with sexual autonomy and freedom.
I think, one of the more fascinating parts of your book is the conversation that you have about gender presentation. This idea of groups, the femmes and the gender benders and the transgressives. And you make a point of pointing out the danger of what, Jack Halberstam has called, Black female masculinity. I initially think about Snoop Pearson from The Wire, or Queen Latifah's character Cleo. And set it off, and we understand this in this kind of popular culture context. But how do these dangers really play out in the everyday lives of some of these women?
Yes. Well, when you think about Black communities, and you think about different class communities, there are some dangers to looking different. There are some dangers to standing out. So you might think about vulnerable groups in those communities. And one group that can be quite vulnerable is the masculine identified woman, a woman who dresses more boyish, because she immediately represents other, because she represents an openly lesbian sexuality. And when you combine that with race, right, with Black masculinity, there's this feeling of threat, not just by the racial community, but by outsiders.
It's criminalized, right? It's a criminalized identity, right?
So thinking about all of the stereotypes that are associated with Black masculinity get imparted on these women's bodies. And so when they walk down the street, I say that they're brave, right? Because they're representing who they are, and they're representing a look, a physical self that is at odds with what mainstream society says, right? Mainstream society says women should look a certain way and have a certain gender presentation. But one thing I wanted to say about these differences in gender presentation, you see them more obviously in Black lesbian communities compared to white lesbian communities. And I argue in the book that this is because in Black communities, for Black womanhood, equality has not been measured in kind of the same ways that white women think about it. So, for example, when you look at Black feminism, the best pathway to women's liberation is about racial equality, and they're not as concerned with being put on a pedestal or being thought of in these stereotypically feminine ways. The opposite is true, right? Black women are accused of being too strong. So having a very feminine presentation of gender doesn't threaten their credibility as strong women. So you could think about, presentations of strong women in our communities. Michelle Obama, she dresses very feminine, but no one doubts that she's a strong Black woman. So there are these, when you add race, it just brings another level of analysis to how we understand all kinds of gender presentation, very feminine and very masculine presentations in the female body.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined by author and professor Mignon Moore, author of the new book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, University of California Press. At the end of the book, in your conclusion, you seem hopeful. You mentioned earlier in the interview the idea that there have been certain things that have happened in the larger culture the last decade or so that's forced folks to find more of a comfort zone in terms of coming out, within Black communities. Are you hopeful about this dynamic? Particularly given, the reality of how the Black church functions at this point in time. I know one of your respondents, mentioned the fact that when you talk to older generations about gay sexualities, they tend to be much more sanctimonious than younger folks are. Yes. In this regard. So are you hopeful as you kind of look at this going forward?
I am hopeful. I mean, I think that this movement from private to public expressions of sexuality has really spurred these open conversations. And I tell people, I say, I tell gay people, when you first came to understand yourself as gay, it might have taken you a moment to really accept that, right? It might have taken you a year or two. So when you come out to your parents or to your loved ones, it might take them some time as well. But I think that we have to be brave and we have to have these conversations, because these conversations allow us to move forward. And we do have the Black church as a presence in the community. The church is moving in all kinds of ways, but the church, it is quite important because it structures the life in Black communities. It's not just a spiritual base, it's a bank, it's a school, it's a political organization, and it also tells us how to live as Black people. It gives us a sense of race consciousness. So the teachings of the church really influence how Black people as a group think about things like sexuality. And so we have to have these discussions in the church as well. And that's a hard thing. As a girl, I grew up in the church, grew up in a Pentecostal church, and I have a strong faith. But at the same time, we have to have this movement forward, and it's through these conversations that we will see progress, I do believe.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Mignon Moore, Associate Professor of Sociology at UCLA, the author of the new book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, University of California Press. It's been great having you on the show today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a good time.
I'm glad. Take care.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.